Okay, we're starting. Good morning. It's Erev Yontif. It's almost it's almost Thanksgiving, but we get to, of course, and then next week at this time already be Hanukkah. So that's like super duper exciting. I'm gonna do something. It's slightly different from what we normally do in the sense of the sort of conceptually. We're gonna do something a little bit more technical. Which I have trouble wrapping my head around it. But, when we work through the text together, we'll see. I hope you got what I sent out, but I'll put it on the screen anyway. This Parsha, Vayeishev, is probably, I don't know, I would say it's the most action-packed Parsha in Bereshis, I would venture to say, because it starts off with the introduction of Yosef and his brothers. And of course, we know how that works out or doesn't. And Yosef, he has dreams and he's telling on them and they're mad at him and the father doesn't do anything and he's going to rule over them and he has another dream. Okay. And then the next Aliyah, they're out in Shechem. If you remember I don't know, it was last year, the year before, we went kind of through the geography of the sale of Yosef, of who actually sold Yosef. And when you read the text carefully, you can see that the brothers are not the ones who actually sold Yosef, but that's Shiur. But anyway, he goes up there and his father says, Yosef, go look for them. And we're gonna just answer this one second. And he says, oh, go find the brothers. And we're like yelling at the screen, like, no, don't go. It's a trap. It's not going to work out well. And he can't find them. And then the stranger says, and he's like, where are they? Oh, yeah, they're over there. And then, of course, Yosef ends up getting sold. Then we have the story of Yehuda and Tamar, which is what we're going to focus on. Not the story so much per se, but the placement of the story. And then we go back to where Yosef is in prison. And he does well. And then before he's in prison, first he's taken as down to Egypt, and he is in the house of Potiphar. And then the wife of Potiphar, Ashes Potiphar, is always trying to seduce him, and she almost does, and that doesn't work. Then he ends up in jail, and then the end of the parsha, of course, he's interpreting dreams in jail. So Yosef is sort of your up and down type of character who's always going through all sorts of iterations of his life. We know how he ends up, but you have to keep in mind that it's Vayeishev, Miketz, Vayigash, Vayechi, 4 full parshas which are dedicated to the story of Yosef and his brothers in different forms or another, but through the different stages of their relationship up until and through their deaths. And then, of course, we go into Book of Shemos. Okay. So what I want to look at is chapter 38. So if you have the Stone Chumash, chapter 38 is on page 208. But when we see that, you have to also kind of see its placement, which is really what I want to look at this morning. So the last thing that we see is the brothers have purportedly sold Joseph, and whatever it is, they come back, he's not there. They take his mini Technicolor dream coat, mini color coat, whatever you want to call it. They take the Kasonas Pasim, they dip it in blood, and they, in a very, very cruel way, they go back to their father. They send it back to their father, and they bring it, and they go, by the way, do you recognize this? Is this your son's cloak or not? Like, we have no idea. And he recognized it, and he says, yes, must be that he was torn up by wild animals. Yaakov tears his garment in mourning. He's mourning for a long time for his son. They try to console him. He does not want to be consoled. And he says, I will go down to the grave mourning for my son. And then and his father cries for him. And then that's Yosef. The very next chapter, it's almost a complete non sequitur, a complete diversion from the text. In other words, if you were writing the story of Yosef, you would say, because the 37th chapter ends, and the Midanim sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, the chamberlain of the butchers. It should continue now. If you skip chapter 38 to chapter 39, Vayeishev Hurad Mitzrayma. So it should go, there's an interlude here, a chapter 38 interlude of the story of Yehuda and Tamar. I remember, quite painfully so, and I guess it was valuable at the time or in life, I don't know, but I didn't appreciate it at the time. But we had to read The Grapes of Wrath in high school. You ever read The Grapes of Wrath? The most boring book in the world. It's awful. I'm sorry. And they make you read the stuff. And I mean, when I say read it, I mean read the Cliff Notes. And what I do remember is that they had these interlude chapters, which had nothing to, I mean, obviously it's very symbolic, but had nothing to do with the story per se. So why is this chapter 38, the story of Yehuda and Tamar, injected over here? Now, when we read it first, we have to, let's, I don't know how to say this, but let's kind of like skim through the story of Yehuda and Tamar. There's a reason why they skip it in school, and you'll see why. It's quite salacious. So it's on page 208, and it says, and we're going to focus, we're not going to get past the first pasuk. So before we get into the first pasuk, let's just kind of read the story if you want to look on the English. Yehuda went down at that time, and he went to a man, his name was Chira. He saw the daughter of a prominent merchant. His name was Shua. He married her and he consorted with her. She conceived and has a son. She calls him Er. She has another son. She calls him Onan. And then a third son called him Shelah. Okay. So Yehuda goes, he gets married. He has 3 kids, Er, Onan, and Shelah. Yehuda took a wife for Er, his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Er's firstborn was evil in the eyes of Hashem, and Hashem caused him to die. So Tamar is married to the Bechor. The daughter-in-law married to the son dies. So by the laws of levirate marriage, when a husband dies and there's no children, the wife is bound to the next brother. Okay? So then Judah says to Onan, consort with your brother's wife and enter into levirate marriage with her, and therefore you will keep his name going. You'll have offspring with through your brother. Okay? But he knew that Onan knew that the seed wouldn't be his. So whatever he wouldn't consort with her either. He was evil, so he dies also. So one daughter-in-law, one son dead, second son dead. So then levirate marriage dictated she should go to the third son, whose name is Shelah. Yehuda says to Tamar, okay, once a fool, twice a philosopher, or something like that. Right? Remain a widow in your father's house until Shelah grows up, because he's like, I don't want him to die like his brothers. So she went and lived in her father's house. Many days passed, and Shua's daughter, the wife of Yehuda, died. So Yehuda he loses his wife, and he goes to check on his sheep, and he goes back to Adulamite. And Tamar, the daughter-in-law, by the way, who's waiting in the wings, because she can't marry anyone else through the laws of levirate marriage. She's bound, so to speak, to the third son. She can't marry, but she's waiting patiently. She's waiting. And she says, look, your father-in-law is coming to Timnah. So what does she do? She doesn't like go out to say, hello, hey, let's have coffee. What she does instead is she removes her widow's garb. She covers herself with a veil. She wrapped herself up. She sat by the crossroads. And she realized that she has to do something because Shelah's already grown up. And he has not been given to her. She's waiting and waiting. Where's my husband, Shelah? So Yehuda saw her. He thought her to be a prostitute, a harlot, since she had covered her face. I guess that's how they did it back then. So he went by the road and he says, please let me be with you. Not knowing, of course, that it's his own daughter-in-law. I mean, I'm telling you, you cannot make up better stories than what we have in the Bible. You cannot, there's nothing better than this. Like Danielle Steele's got nothing on us. I don't know, whatever. I've never... Full disclosure, never read a Danielle Steele book in my life. I just know that she's pretty popular. I don't know what she writes, but whatever. Anyway, and so she says, okay, no, let's discuss payment. What are you going to give me? He says, I'll give you an animal. And she says, okay, that's fine, but I need a mashkon. I need some sort of security deposit. So what should I give you? She says, give me your signet, your wrap, and your staff. He gives it to her. He lies with her. And of course, in the Bible, anytime that happens, they become pregnant. So she becomes pregnant by her. So let's get this straight. She was married to the son died. Married to the second son died. She's bound to the third son, waiting around for him. So instead, she seduces her father-in-law and gets pregnant by her father-in-law. Okay, this is the original episode of Jerry Springer right here. Never saw that either. Okay, so she gets up, she removes the veil, and then she goes back to being a widow. So Yehuda, being the mensch that he is, he has to send, he wants to get his security deposit back, and he wants to pay for his services, and he sends payment. They go, they send, they're like, yeah, I don't know, where is she? They're like, where's the prostitute that was there? They're like, well, I don't know, there was no prostitute here. He goes to Judah and they says, can't find her. Nobody knows who she is. It was a ghost. So he says, okay, let her keep them, meaning like let her keep the deposit items, lest we become a laughing stock. It says, I tried to pay her. I tried to do the right thing, but there was nobody there. The check was returned. What am I supposed to do? So 3 months later come, and Judah was told, by the way, your daughter-in-law Tamar is pregnant. Not only that, she has conceived sort of illegitimately. They say Zansa, that she through harlotry. Obviously, I mean, she can't be with another man. So how could it be? Now, we could stand up with the righteous indignation of like, he's allowed to do whatever he wants, but if she does it, then she's condemned to death. Yeah, that's a big point here, because Yehuda says, take her out and let her be burned. As she's taking out, she sends words to her father-in-law saying, by the way, by the man to whom these belong. Because they're like, who's the father, right? Who is it? So she doesn't say, it was you, Yehuda. She doesn't rat him out where she easily could have. She puts the ball in his court by saying, by the way, if you know to whom these belong. Now, by the way, it should not be lost on you. And this explains also part of the juxtaposition. If you look at the Hebrew in Pasuk Chaf Hey, page 212, it says, "He mutzeis v'hi shalchel chamil emar l'isha she'ela la necherav atamar hakerna l'mi hachosemes v'apasil v'matah ha'ela." She's found out, she's recognized, and she just says to Yehuda, "Hakerna, do you recognize to whom these belong?" Now he could have easily swept it under the carpet, and he could have said nothing, and he could have done, not me. But instead, what does he do? He recognizes and he says, she's right. It's from me because I didn't give her to Sheila, my son, and he was never with her again. He owns it up. He owns up to it. And that's the story. And then, of course, we have the birth of twins from this, which ironically leads to the birth of Mashiach, Peretz and Zarach. And we have the story of Rus, our descendants from this, David HaMelech descendant from this. I mean, like, not Rus, but David HaMelech, whose descendants marry Rus, but comes from this. From Peretz, okay? If you look at the end of the story of Ruth, right? So just to not take my word for it, the last these are the generations of Peretz. Peretz has Chetzron, Chetzron has Ram, Ram has Aminadav, Aminadav has Nachshon, Nachshon has Salma, Salma has Boaz, Boaz has Oved, Oved has Yishai, Yishai has David. So direct lineage from King David to this episode. The king who's going to beget Mashiach comes from this episode, which goes again to prove our point that God picks the heroes from the most unlikely of places. He's not somebody who's sitting and learning full-time in Lakewood necessarily, but could be from some puzzling backgrounds. Anyway, he goes. But the reason why I pointed that pasuk in Chaf Hey, at the end of the previous chapter, at the end of chapter 37, when they send the garment back, the blood-soaked garment, back to Yaakov Avinu, look at page 206, Lamed Beis, and then it jumps off the page at you, and it's the Torah's way of giving, like, the smack in the face of this big smackdown. It says they sent, they sent the Kesonas Pasim, they said, we found this, and they said, Hakerna hakesonas ben chahiyim lo. And it's most likely Yehuda the one who presents, he says, Hakerna, do you recognize, is this the garment of your son? And look what words Tamar uses against Yehuda. She says to him, Hakerna, do you recognize? It's the Torah's way of directing you, saying one has to do with the other. One might even be payment for the other. One might be a payback for the other. Okay, so that's the story in a nutshell. There's a lot to discuss there. There's a lot that's very disturbing about it. And like I said, you understand why we don't read this in school. So let's go back to the beginning of the chapter. We're going to just look at the first pasuk and the first Rashi, and then we're going to see some other things. So the first pasuk says, "Vayihi ba'esahi, vayered Yehuda me'esacha, vayed ad ish adulami ushmochira." It was at that time. Now, what does that mean when it says it was at that time? Yehuda left his brothers. Now, ostensibly, it would seem that Yosef was sold somehow, and he went down to Egypt. After that, okay, like now what? Okay. Good run. See you guys later. He separates from his brothers, and then this episode takes place, and then the story picks up again when Yosef is in Mitzrayim. Okay? So Rashi even supports that. Look at Rashi, what Rashi says, the first Rashi. Vayihi ba'esahi, lama nisbecha parsha zu lakan v'hifsik b'parshaso shel Yosef. So Rashi's asking the obvious question. Why would this story be juxtaposed to the previous chapter and hifsiko and interrupt in the narrative of the story of Joseph? That as soon as they saw what they did to their father, how much pain they caused their father with the missing Joseph, and that they were directly involved and a causative part of it. So when they saw how much pain they caused their father, it says that Yehuda kind of was degraded in their eyes. That's why it says, Vayered Yehuda me'es echav. He was demoted, so to speak. Yehuda was the natural leader. And we have seen this in the past, by the way, we looked at. When Reuven tries to speak to them, nobody pays attention. But when Yehuda speaks to them, they listen. So Yehuda was the natural leader. But now, after they saw the pain that was caused, and by the way, he restores that role later on in Parshas Vayigash and Parshas Vayechi. But before that happens, he is now demoted in their eyes. That's why Vayered Yehuda, Rashi says. Amru, ata amarta lamachro, ilo amarta lashiva hayini shomim. They say, you said we should sell him. If you would have told, we would have listened to anything you would have said, Yehuda. If you would have told us to bring him back, we would have brought him back. Okay? So Rashi says that in other words, that this parsha takes place immediately after the sale of Joseph. Now, here's where we and it's something it's not my most comfortable sort of teaching thing when it comes to teaching Chumash or Tanakh or whatever, is because I'm very, very bad at math. I hope some people here are really good at math. I'm not very good at math because you have to be able to sort of visualize the timelines and things like that. So especially when we talk about Jewish history, and we're trying to think, first temple, second temple, and who was when, who was a contemporary of whom, Talmud, Mishnah, Gemara, so there's lots of things that we have to take into account. But off the bat, I'll ask you a question. Before we know anything about Yosef and his brothers or anything, the story of Yehuda, okay, so let's just recap. Yehuda gets married. He has 3 children. The 3 children grow up old enough to get married. First marriage doesn't work out. Second marriage doesn't work out. Waiting for the third marriage to take place, she gets pregnant, and then the whole crux of that story. Now, how much time do you think that would take? Right? I mean, how much time does it take to get married, to have kids, to marry off 2 out of 3 of them and wait for the third one, and then have another pregnancy, et cetera, et cetera? It should take a lot of time, which is exactly what bothers a lot of the Mefarshim here. Because, and by the way, and we also know for sure that how many years was Yosef away from his father? The same that Yaakov was away from his, it seems. But Yosef was away from his father, and the way that you remember it is we say Vayechi Yaakov. Vayechi Yaakov. It says he only lived the time that he was actually with Yosef. Now he was with Yosef, it was 10, 28, 34 years. He only had 34 years with him. But we know that Yaakov was away from Yosef for a very long time. And it was a total of 22 years. 22 years he was there, and that's how long Yaakov was away from his parents. Again, showing the causality, the midah connected midah, etc. Now, do you think that this story could take place in 22 years? You do, okay. So some people do, right? So it's possible. So let's see. What I want to share with you is this Ibn Ezra and a couple of other Mefarshim, and let's see kind of what they do with it. Okay, you see it on my screen? Great. Okay. This is the Ibn Ezra. I'll just read it in the English here. Okay. So it came to pass. This doesn't refer to the time that Joseph was sold. It refers to the events that happened prior to that time. From thence they journeyed unto Gudgod, and that time the Lord separated the tribe of Levi to bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, to stand before the Lord, to minister unto him, to bless his name unto this day. He quotes a pasuk in Devarim, which is similar, meaning that when it says at that time, it doesn't necessarily mean immediately, but you have to understand it in context. The tribe of Levi was chosen to minister to Hashem in the second year, while Israel journeyed to Gudgod in the 40th year. He says, I'll explain that later. So then why then does the Torah insert this chapter at this point, when logic dictates that when Yosef was brought down to Egypt should follow, and they sold him into Egypt? In other words, we should go straight from the end of chapter 37 to the beginning of chapter 39, just like we started saying, okay? So why put the chapter in the middle? The Bible places this chapter to contrast the behavior of Joseph vis-a-vis his master's wife with that of Judah toward his daughter-in-law. So in other words, the Ibn Ezra is saying, forget about chronology. Now, there's in general a machlokas about what we say is ein mukta me'ucher b'Torah. Is there absolute chronology in the Torah? And there are some that would swear by it, and there are some that say, no, there isn't. And by the way, we have instances with days, dates, and years where it's clearly not the case, particularly in Bamidbar, where we have a date which is later, which is found before a date which is earlier. In other words, so it's specifically out of order. So there's lots of discussion about that. But here, it's obviously inserted. In other words, why would the bigger question, not so much even out of order, but why would we have this interlude of a chapter? It has to be there to teach us something. So the Ibn Ezra says that we want to contrast the behavior of Yosef with his master's wife. Again, that's the next chapter where Yosef resists the temptation to be with his master's wife, and she's trying every single day to seduce him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And versus that of Yehuda towards his daughter-in-law. He says, what forced me? So he says, why do I have to say that? The Ibn Ezra says, what forced me to offer this interpretation is the fact that only 22 years passed between the sale of Joseph and the descent of our ancestors into Egypt. Now, we learn this in the chapter in the birth of Onan, Judah's second son, and is reaching the age of procreation, which at the very earliest starts at the age of 12. And then scripture goes on to state, and in the process of time, because it says, Vayirbu hayamim vatama bashua beis Yehuda, that after a lot of time passed, Yehuda's wife died. The chapter then tells us that Tamar conceived and gave birth to Perez. So this same Perez came to Egypt with two sons of his own. Okay? And he says, don't be disturbed by the question of Batsal. I'll explain when I come to it. Okay. So what the Ibn Ezra is saying is that there's no way that this entire story could have taken place from the time that they sold Yosef until the time that they come down to Egypt. Because, and he proves it from chronology, Peretz, etc. Look at the Das HaKanim. Das HaKanim in Bali Tosfos, also from the earlier, and this I found in English as well, he goes a little bit more into detail. And he says, and Yehuda descended. Our sages explained that this choice words by the Torah means that Yehuda's brothers, who up until then had considered him as their leader and spokesman, demoted him on the account of the sale of the brother Joseph and the anguish this caused their father. Okay, so this is what Rashi quoted. That's why it says Vayered, that he was demoted. He actually uses the word demoted. Okay. Ibn Ezra questioned this, seeing that only 22 years elapsed between the sale of Joseph and the reunification of the brothers with him and the families moving to Egypt. Now we know Joseph had been 17 years old when he's sold. We also know that he's 30 when he interpreted Paro's dream. And we further know that the family descended to Egypt in the second year of the famine, 9 years after Yosef had been appointed viceroy of Egypt. So if you count the years from the time Yehuda got married to the daughter of the man described before the descent of the whole family with Yehuda at their head, more than 22 years must have passed. If we count a year for each time Yehuda's wife was pregnant with each of her three sons, and add the years after Onan's death, which Shelah grew to maturity, meaning he was old enough to get married, you've already counted for 16 years. Add a year until Peretz could have been born, and you have 17. And even if you'd assume that Peretz was no more than 7 years old when he became the father of Chetzron, and another year for the birth of his brother Chamul, which is recorded in Parshas Vayigash, all of whom are listed in 46 as having come to Egypt with Yaakov and Yehuda, you've accounted already for 25 years, not 22. So one would have to say that when Shelah is described as having grown up, the Torah refers to him having become 9 years old, at which age it is possible to produce semen fit to sire a child. Again, I'm not a scientist. I don't know, whatever. The Mefarshim have a lot of discussion about how old the tribes were when they were born, how close in age they were, how old does somebody have to be, et cetera, et cetera. We could find support for this from the Talmud in Nida, where the Mishnah discusses a 9-year-old who performed levirate marriage ceremony on his sister-in-law, whose husband had died without having any children. He can't give his sister-in-law a decree of divorce until he reaches the age of 13, as the minor cannot divorce his wife. Moreover, the original marriage of his deceased brother, blah, blah, blah. Okay, anyway, so he goes in and he gives this this explanation, okay? But my point is that the Mefarshim, they kind of have to like bend over and twist themselves into all types of pretzels to figure out, like, why is it that how do you explain Vayihi ba'esahi? What does it mean at that moment? So you could either be like the Eben Ezra, and you could say, no, it didn't happen then. That his marriage to this and the story with Tamar happened perhaps simultaneously with the story of Joseph. It doesn't have to be one and then the other. It could be one and the other, and they happen at the same time. And by the way, concurrently, these episodes are kind of going to fuse into place, and they're going to be part of the entire story of the narrative of Yaakov and his sons and the two brothers. Okay, now I want to share with you. I didn't copy it for you, but I want to share with you two more pieces. The Chizkuni says, he quotes Rashi, and really it says Vayered Yehuda, that Yehuda himself went down, and it says that he went down because he went by himself. He couldn't tolerate the pain that he caused his father. Not that his brothers demoted him, but that he couldn't tolerate the pain that he himself had caused. And he says, this is what Rashi, and he says Rashi, and he quotes Rashi as well. And that's what he says, that but Yehuda went down from his brothers, meaning they demoted him. Okay. And if you want to say that if you're going to say at this point, it's only, again, the 22 years until they go down to Egypt, when Yosef sees his father again, how's it possible that in this span, he could have 3 sons? And it says also that he waited a lot of time until Yehuda's wife died, and he had to wait for Shelah to grow up. And then she has a baby, and then meaning Tamar has a baby with her father-in-law, and she has twins, Peretz and Zarach, and Peretz has a child, and he has another child before they go to Egypt. He says, Tshuva l'davar, ein litmo al kach. He says, don't bother me with years. Don't get too excited about chronology and about time and this and that. So a lot of times, this is an approach in Mefarshim when sort of like things don't technically fit in. Okay, so let me give you a classic example of this, and where you have to rely on things that are maybe lamala min hateva, things that are not necessarily in the realm of nature or don't fit into our understanding, or even science sometimes. Okay, now I'm not saying that science is not real. I'm just saying that sometimes the Mefarshim are not so bothered, so to speak, by the facts. It's like they could be the modern day media. I don't know. The think about Kriyas Yamsuf. This is a question we've had. We bring this up all the time. Okay, there are 600,000 men from the age of 20 to 60, and so we estimate probably about 2 to 3 million people. Okay, now ask yourselves, what's the greatest number of people you've ever seen in one place? Greatest number of people we've ever seen in one place was twice in my lifetime. Here in the United States, when we had marches in Washington. It was one in 1986, if you remember. There was a rally for Soviet Jewry. And if you remember, in around 2000, 2001, there was a rally for Israel, okay? And probably maxed out there maybe 600,000 people. And that's a lot of people. So imagine multiplying that by 3 at least, and telling them they're going to cross a body of water and that it's going to happen overnight. It's hard to kind of fathom how that works. So here what the Chizkuni says, he says, don't worry about so much. Don't let that bother you so much. He says, the first generations, he says, they would have birth after 7 years. And he quotes from Seder Olam. Shana achas also libur shel er, acheres la'onon, acheres l'shela, higdil er v'sheh shavashem v'nasa tamar. To have 3 sons and to grow up and to marry Tamar, it's already 7 years. So he says it's already 8 years since the time that Yehuda goes down. The 9th year, she marries Onan, and he dies. In the 10th year is already when Sheila grows up, and she waits. So that she gets impregnated by Yehuda only 10 years into the story. And then when she's waiting, that's when it happens, and that's already in the 12th year, she has Peretz and Zarach. So in other words, he calculates, the Pizkuni does, that from the time of the beginning of the story, when Yehuda leaves his brothers, until he himself fathers these twins, Peretz and Zarach, is only 12 years. And then Peretz waited 7 years, and he got married, and then it's 19 years, and then Yehuda goes down, and then he has another one. So in other words, that's how you get 22 years. But he's saying that these kids get married very young, and they have kids at age 7, 8, and 9, again, which is a little bit hard to fathom, not necessarily so easy for us to wrap that around our heads. But the point is that the Chizkuni, again, a lot of Mefarshim discuss this, not so bothered by it. I want to share one last thing with you. And that's from again, not from a later source, from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky wrote a sefer called Emes Liakov on Chumash, which is just phenomenal. And he writes as follows. It went on that day, he says, because his comment is on Vayehi Ba'esahi. And he says, and he proves it from another place where he wrote earlier in Parshas Vayera, that anytime it says Vayehi Ba'esahi, it means, and it was at that time, Hakavanahi sheparsha zu shanachnu asukim ba achshav be'emes eino sheichas l'kan klal. What it means is, it doesn't mean that it happened now. It means that this is a non sequitur, that what's happening, what's being related right now in the text is not actually happening now, and it's nothing to do with this period of time at all. He says, because what we're doing is we're exactly that. It's an interlude. We are interrupting the narrative with another story. We're interrupting the arc of the story with a side story. And by the way, in any drama, in any television show or series or movie, there's not always just one story. There's a few story arcs taking place, and they're sort of interwoven one with the other, and they may not necessarily be happening at the same time. So he says, when it says Ba'isahi, it's indicating to you that we are interrupting our regularly scheduled programming, and we are having another story that's being inserted here and he calls it Inyan Sidadi, which means a side issue, a side story, to teach us something. So, as we saw, the one of the Mefarshim told us that it's to teach us a lesson of the difference between the way Yosef dealt with his temptation versus the way Yehuda did. Okay, and he quotes the Medrash, Rabbi Yaakov does, and it's saying it's something much larger than that. So he says, why does it say that? He quotes the Medrash, the Faresh sheikar mashahivi parsha zukan hulanachem el sanu shekodem shemetchilas hagola shel Mitzrayim kvar nolad avi malchus beis David melech HaMashiach. What's happening is what I mentioned earlier. What is the end result of this whole episode with Yehuda and Tamar? It's the end of Megillas Rus. And Peretz has this, and he has this, and he has this, and he has this, and Yishai, Oved, Yishai, and David. In other words, what's about to happen in the next chapter? In the next chapter, what's about to happen is that Yosef goes to Mitzrayim. If Yosef goes to Mitzrayim, then what's going to happen? The brothers, and ultimately the father, and ultimately all 70 of this entire clan are going to go down to Mitzrayim, and they're going to be stuck there for a really long time. And the prophecy that was given to Avram in chapter 15 is going to come true, and they're going to be strangers in a strange land, and they're going to be enslaved. And it's not until hundreds of years later, whichever opinion you want to take, how long they're there, that of course we get at the beginning of Sefer Shemos through Parshas Beshalach until they can leave. what's happening? They're going to be enslaved. So we're about to like really go down to Mitzrayim, but kind of like the success arc of our story is going to take a huge hit. And it's going to be a very negative period for the Jewish people. So the reason why this chapter is inserted here is that, you know what? It's the Torah's way of telling you, play the long game. The long game is that here you are in Gullus, you're in exile, and you're in a terrible spot. But look, God has already planted the seeds of Mashiach. God has already set the stage for the ultimate redemption to take place. Now, I don't think they know that at the time, and I don't think we know that. We only know that because we're privy, we get an outside look in, and we can see how this works. But this is the design and the structure of, and the beauty of the Torah and the text of the Torah, is that it gives us a blueprint for life. And the blueprint for life, that's a hard one. Wow. The blueprint for life is that when we are entering into our worst stages, we may not realize that God has already laid the groundwork for our salvation. Before the Gullus is already the Geula. Before the injury, the cure is already founded. And that's what it says, that God always creates the refuah before the makkah, always the healing before the actual plague. That's why the Jewish people are in Egypt, and they don't realize that the salvation is going to come from the place that they hate the most, which is Pharaoh's palace, but already Moshe Rabbeinu is being born there. Same thing with Esther and with Mordechai, and they're being destroyed. But look, God has already put Esther in the palace, and she's going to save them. So this is the reason of this juxtaposition. So Vayiba Esahi, Rashi says, Lama nismicha, you could spend your time trying to figure out and turn yourself inside and out to figure out chronology, and do the dates work out, and he's this old, he's that old. That's one way of doing things. On the other hand, what we could also do is we could say, maybe take a more of a macro view, more of a homiletic view of this, and say what really is happening, the Torah is telling us, is that God is laying the groundwork for ultimate redemption, and that any subjugation or any slavery, that's all temporary, but God's permanent plans have already been put into motion, and that's what's happening. So we have to always, when it comes to, that's why we're such students of Jewish history, is that we have to look at the bigger picture. And I keep saying that over and over, we never look at just one parsha. We never learn just one chapter. We have to learn the chapters. We also have to look and see how do they fit in a larger scheme of God's plans, which we try to get a glimpse into. And here Chazal are telling us, and that's why Rabbi Yaakov is telling us exactly that. That God is giving us a glimpse. He's giving us a peek into the window and saying, look, it's all there. It's all ready for you. You have to just be ready for it, and you have to be waiting. So that's what I wanted to, again, this is not, it's a little different because it's very, very technical. Now you could spend a lot of time trying to figure out years and dates and ages and this and that, and people do that. It makes my head spin, to be honest with you. But I think it's important to understand that, if we were writing the chapters and we have this kind of really odd story, very, very salty kind of story that's put into the text, there has to be a greater reason why it's there and why it's placed there. It could have been done earlier, it could have been done later, or not at all. The reason why it's there is it teaches about character development. That a lot of it is about Yehuda, also about Yehuda's ability to say Sod Kamimeni, and that's also laying the work for King David. King David himself also possesses this quality that when he is pointed out to him that he's doing something wrong, he says, "You're right, I am wrong," which is a big deal. Not everybody can do that, especially men. And what happens is that this is it's an indication of the righteousness of Tamar and the righteousness of Yehuda and how he's able to own up to his shortcomings, but really about the whole future of the Jewish people. So that's what I wanted to share with you this morning. I hope everybody has a wonderful, wonderful Yontif this week. And next week, it's a double Yontif. We have Thanksgiving and Isra Chag on Thursday, Friday, and then already Sunday, we go into Hanukkah. So we'll see next week. Maybe we'll do a little bit of Hanukkah, something, I'm not sure. But I hope everybody has a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you. You
Bye.
too.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Rabbi.
you.